Okay, so we get from Plato a particular view of knowledge, and he's trying to argue against the sophists, which were the relativistic itinerant teachers that Socrates held a lot of discussions with. We saw him looking at Thrasymachus on the issue of justice. And most of the time, the sophists, they were about rhetoric. They were about winning arguments. And part of their strategy was to look like you really know what you're talking about. Whereas we saw that Socrates was much humbler about knowledge and our ability to acquire it. So they were skeptics and relativists. They thought real knowledge may not even be attainable. The best we can have is opinion or beliefs, and one person's opinion is as good as another, so they were very relativistic in their views. Each person, is a measure of what seems right to them. So Plato's and Socrates are reacting against this. Now, the thing is that there's a subtle point here in ancient philosophical scholarship that's worth at least mentioning. One question that experts who study Plato's dialogues raise is, how much can we trust them to be portrayals of the real Socrates? Okay? Now, we saw that there were other people who wrote about Socrates. Xenophon is another writer who Plato didn't think got him right. We saw Aristophanes tries to portray Socrates, among other things, as a nature philosopher, and gives you a kind of picture of Socrates as a buffoon. His comedies are something like Saturday Night Live sketches today when they try to criticize some public figure. And Socrates was a well-known public figure. So we saw that Aristophanes portrays him as a nature philosopher, but as his trial, Socrates tried to distance himself from those views. He was more concerned with questions of ethics and what is a good life for a human being, how do we achieve it, what is justice, what's a just form of government, and less concerned with the kinds of things that preoccupied those pre-Socratic philosophers, metaphysical topics like what's the structure of the physical world, and is there basically one element or irreducibly more than one element, and how do we argue a position on that. Socrates wasn't very concerned with that stuff, so it may seem odd that you get put into the mouth of Socrates a very developed two-tiered theory of reality. Well, the view on that, without going into any kind of a big digression, the view on this, on whether we can trust the portrait of Socrates in Plato's dialogues, it seems best to me is the one that says, well, look, Plato wrote the early dialogues to try to set the record straight on just who Socrates was and respond to bad portraits of Socrates from people like Aristophanes. So the early dialogues, like the Apology, the Meno, and we just saw a clip from the Meno, the Phaedo, the Crito, those probably give us a pretty accurate portrayal of Socrates as he really was. But when we get into what are called the middle dialogues, where the theory of forms is advocated in the Republic, and the later dialogues, a lot of what we get is Plato's more technically precise, more developed views put into the mouth of Socrates as a character. And most scholars on ancient philosophy think this is what's happening here. But the thing is, Plato basically is not advocating things that Socrates would have disagreed with, but he's developing Socrates' views in a more organized and technical way. So the sophists then were arguing that real knowledge is beyond human abilities, but Plato tries to say that we can have knowledge, and it differs from just having opinions and beliefs about things. And for Plato, things in this world are in a constant state of becoming, B-E-C-O-M-I-N-G. This thing covers up the whiteboard. That is, this world is changing and in constant change so much that things are never stably what they are. They're always in a state of becoming or changing into something else. That is, that this world is like Heraclitus portrayed it as constantly changing. But Plato is going to argue that we can have genuine knowledge, and that Parmenides was right. Real knowledge can't be of changing, fleeting things in this world, but the objects of real knowledge are what he calls the forms. That is, stable, eternal standards for things in a world beyond the senses. And he argues that our souls were once acquainted with these objects. So Plato is going to try to convince us that there is a separate realm of eternal entities that is beyond the reach of our senses, but that not only are real, but we're going to see he's going to try to argue they're more real than any particular things in this world. So the question that we can raise, because this is far from an uncontroversial view, even in Plato's day, is, well, why should we think there are such things anyway? Well, and the first argument, which is sometimes called the epistemological argument for the forms, remember, epistemology is the branch of philosophy dealing with the scope and limits of our knowledge. This argument says, well, we ought to believe there are such eternal entities because real knowledge needs to be knowledge of what is stable and eternal and unchanging, and the forms fit the bill, right? Now, this is a definition Plato gives us of knowledge, that it's true justified belief. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just mention it. In other words, if someone believes Thomas Jefferson to have been the first president of the United States, it would be odd to say, well, John knows that Thomas Jefferson was the first president of the United States. Well, why would it be wrong to say that he knows that? Well, among other things, it's false, right? George Washington was. So it seems like if we know something, what we know, first of all, needs to be true, it seems odd to say we know something that's false. But also, it would seem odd to say that we think we know something to be true, but don't at the same time believe it to be true. So we need to minimally believe what we claim to know. But of course, belief, while it might be necessary for knowledge, is not alone sufficient, right? We can believe things that are false. So we need more than just belief. Something needs to be true that we claim to know, but also justified. And here's the big controversial part, where Socrates tries to argue his case for why he shouldn't escape, for why he shouldn't accept his friend's offer of escape in that Crito selection we looked at last week. In other words, he tries to back up with reasons what he thinks is the right decision there. So real knowledge should be anchored in reasons. So opinion can be of what is changeable, true or false, maybe true today, false tomorrow, right? It is raining. Well, that's false right now, but maybe 2 days from now, if I say it is raining, it'll be true. Ungrounded in reasons. You may not have a good reason for what you have an opinion about, and it may be just acquired by persuasion without a good reason to back it up. Whereas knowledge, he thinks, and again, disregard these pages. They're from a textbook called Philosophical Conversations that I used one semester, and that was what I constructed this from. But it follows basically Plato's presentation, but I'm following the textbook discussion of this. But you don't need the book to follow what I'm saying here. So knowledge has to be of what is enduring and always true, grounded in good reasons and acquired by instruction, and of course for Socrates, either in this life or the previous life. Yeah.
Is there ever any time where those two things intersect? For example, we've been taught Christopher Columbus discovered America. That was known to be fact at the time, and now we know it's not.
And why? Okay. Well, right. Are you saying because people like Leif Erikson got there before he did, or in what sense do you say it's false?
Well, first of all, the question was, is there ever a time when those two intersect? And I use Christopher Columbus as an example. We know for fact that that's not true.
Well, okay. You actually raise a good point, and that's that particular facts like that. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's either true or false. Yeah, for us, but for Plato, fleeting facts are not the objects of what he wants to call knowledge. Now, this is a difference between the way Plato uses the word knowledge and the way you and I do, right? I mean, I heard last night that the Orioles, after losing again to Boston, are now officially out of the playoff picture, right? And, so... But that particular fact would not, in other words, it would say, well, I know the Orioles lost last night, because I did come home late and turned it on just in time. The A's lose. If you say, well, I know the Orioles lost last night, that's a particular fact that I know. But for Plato, real knowledge is of things like enduring truths of mathematics, like the slave boy was concerned with, truths of geometry.
Yeah.
Oh, he also thought we can have enduring knowledge of things like moral principles. What's the nature of justice? What's the nature of holiness, or stuff like that? So for him, real knowledge then is not about fleeting facts in this world, but about more eternal things. So you raise a good point. But part of the answer is, for Plato, the statement, even if it's true, in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, is just a fleeting particular fact. And it's not something that we have real knowledge of, even if it's true. Whereas you and I believe we can have knowledge of, and that there's a perfectly understandable, common sense way in which you and I talk about having knowledge of what Plato says we can only have opinion of. In other words, the best I can have is a true opinion that George Washington was the first president of the United States. But that, for him, is not knowledge. Whereas if we're talking about something like, the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, for Plato, that's something that never changes and is eternally true, and that would be an object of knowledge for him. For him. So it is important to see that Plato and other philosophers in what's called the rationalist tradition have a different concept of what knowledge is. Where, knowledge has to be something that's absolutely, certainly true, and true eternally, so to speak. So, no, very good point. So the reason I wanted to make sure I showed that video, and I couldn't get it to behave this morning. I'm going to have to try to show it to the 10 o'clock class next time. Socrates talks to Meno's slave boy and moves the boy from the area of opinion to knowledge, because when he sees the justification for why, if you build build a square twice the area of a given square, you build it on the diagonal with one of the sides being the diagonal. And we're going to ask you to write out that proof later. So hope you follow it. No. If y'all did your time in geometry in high school, that's all you need to worry about. Okay. Not asking you to relive geometry class, but the point is, when the young boy is questioned, and this is what's going on in the background. We're supposed to buy Plato's claim that Socrates is not teaching the boy geometry here. He's only asking him questions, right? So basically Plato's going to say that, well, wait a second, this is a slave boy. How is it that he can be asked these questions? And now he's starting to get the answers right. Right? Well, Socrates gives us only two options. And in logic, we call this a false dilemma. That's an argument where you falsely present two options as if they're the only two possibilities. Well, this is a slave boy, Meno's slave boy. Now remember, in ancient Greek times, slavery was condoned as moral. You don't get a moral argument raised here about the fact that he's a slave boy, whereas, to us today, I mean, slavery is absolutely repugnant morally. But they accepted it in that culture. So the idea is that, as the son of a carpenter, I know geometry because we have a free public education system, and even the son of a carpenter can learn something about geometry, whereas back then, if you were a slave, you didn't. So the thought is, well, the boy has never been taught geometry, and so Socrates says, well, either the boy would have to have learned what he learned in this present life, or he would have had to have acquired it before his soul became incarnated in this body. And so we're supposed to say, well, of course he didn't learn it in this life because he's a slave boy and he didn't have a formal course in geometry, didn't have the opportunity to go to Athens Polytechnic Institute like I did Baltimore Polytechnic Institute, right? So the point is, when the boy sees the reasons for the geometric proof, that raises him to the level of knowledge. Socrates' argument is, and he presents this in a different dialogue, the Phaedo, where they're discussing life after death and whether we can have any reason to hope for life beyond the grave, which is a convenient thing to be doing a few, weeks before Socrates' execution. Well, basically in the Phaedo, I'm losing my train of thought. Socrates argues for the immortality of the soul, and he argues that if we can get what I was going to say is his argument is that we lose or the knowledge that we once knew when supposedly our soul was acquainted with these eternal truths is lost when a body becomes incarnate. Okay, we have about 4 minutes, so at least let me try to finish up the present argument. I try to keep the classes together, but it doesn't always work out that way. I mean, the 10 o'clock in your class. So the thought is, inquiry is worth doing because we can have real knowledge, but it's in a latent state. But if we ask the right questions, we pull it out. So teachers today talk about using the Socratic method, and usually what they mean by that is, well, they ask the class questions to try to get them to bring out things they supposedly read for homework the night before, right? But you can see the assumption here in the real Socratic method is that these things were learned by this boy before, and by this boy's soul before he ever came into this life, but they've been knocked into a latent state. But by asking questions, we can bring them up to the level of knowledge. So what does the slave boy have knowledge of, though? Not of the fleeting sand drawings, the very imperfect sand drawings. Genuine knowledge for Plato is not about such fleeting and changing things and such imperfect things as sand drawings of squares and triangles. Genuine knowledge isn't even acquired through the senses, but by reason. This is a central point of Plato's view. It's about what is enduring. And so genuine knowledge then has to be about eternal, unchanging entities. And here's where we get into Plato's claim that there are such eternal, unchanging entities as perfect standards for what a triangle is or a square. Think about it. Did what it is to be a triangle come into existence when the person drew a triangle on a rock face in a cave or whatever? Or was it somehow always around what a triangle is? Well, of course, for Plato, it would be always around. So genuine knowledge has to be of what's perfect and eternal, and we just have 2 or 3 minutes. And these objects, the forms for him, are exactly that. Yeah.
Is that theory sort of like if a tree falls in the woods and no one is around here,
No, that's the philosopher Berkeley's view that as per Hippie, for him to be is to be perceived by some mind or other. So if there's no mind around, does the tree make a sound? Well, of course, for Berkeley, God is always there to perceive it. So we can be confident that it makes a sound. But no, we'll look at that later on. But I'm gonna continue from this slide. Look at it. It's there in Blackboard for you, and the pages. Okay, if anyone missed the role when I called it.